Hi everyone, Dirthany Bike Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of this new Paris, Texas album, Mid-Air. California independent hip-hop duo Paris, Texas. This is their second full-length LP. They have been building quite a bit of buzz as of late, dropping a breakout debut in the midst of the pandemic. I was getting a lot of requests to cover their music live on stream around that point. What I had heard at the time, I was not crazy about. Maybe sounded a little too rough around the edges and in the incubation stage to pull apart. Though I appreciated the raw and kind of punky energy they were approaching a lot of their tracks with, because while you could call what the duo does rap, there's also a lot of lo-fi, punk, and rock influences in what they do. It's eclectic for sure, and in that way, it may appeal to fans of Brockhampton or Kenny Mason. Tizo Touchdown as well. The last two of those guys are actually featured on the record. So yeah, in a way, Paris, Texas does have a similar quirky musical chameleon appeal. And I do hear a lot of influences flowing throughout the songs on this album. However, what I'm not hearing is what makes Paris, Texas per se, because there's a lot of material here that feels kind of derivative on top of the execution being a bit off too. There's 1037, the opening track, where it seems like the duo is really trying to come out with both guns blazing. There's some pulsating synth bass, driving drums, kind of builds up with some roaring walls of distortion and shouty vocals about getting into the pit. It's a sort of interesting fusion of goth, synth, rave vibes and hype rap verses, but it's just not that explosive of an introduction to this album. The production feels a bit too squished down and lacking in color to really have that much punch. Then with the song Split Screen, we get another vibe change with it just kind of being a straight up hip hop song, but the sloppy and amateurish flows kind of remind me of the early days of Odd Future, especially with the rickety production and kind of weird attitude. The whole thing just sounds unflatteringly messy and sloppy, but is trying to get by on being alternative in a way. Like that's the reason it's not cleanly or well executed, I guess, when in reality it doesn't sound as colorful or as big as it could because it's weakly produced, boringly arranged, and even the performances sound like a knockoff of something else. The rap verses, the very gravelly ones, like around the midpoint of the track, sound like Zombie Juice on a Flatbush track. And there's plenty of other moments on the record that fall short in this same way. They feel like a watered down version of another thing I've enjoyed more somewhere else. Like with Everybody Safe Until, I'm sorry, this is just like a song from Kid Cudi's Speeding Bullet to Heaven, and that's it. There's also Ain't No High, and I'm sorry, with this track, I am not subjecting myself to a bad Where Is My Mind ripoff in 2023. I'm just not. This is not new or interesting or refreshing. This is Kohl's and Walmart levels of exposure to indie rock and alt rock. The song Liftoff starts with what sounds like a very bad George Clinton impression. Yeah, that's a total non-starter. And then a new whip is like if you had Brockhampton and Yeezus era Kanye collaborating, but you got absolutely no ferocity out of them whatsoever. We're talking Weenie Hut Jr. levels of energy and impact on this. It's just not the least bit explosive, even though its reference points very much are, which is weird because it's a hard contrast in terms of excitement and volume on the following Panic, which does have legitimately grimy walls of distorted synthesizers and bass. Maybe it's all a bit too synced up with the drum beats, but at least they hit hard. And the track also ends out of nowhere, not exactly great songwriting or anything, but it is a vibe while it's on, I suppose. Sean Jared, I also want to shout out because that may be the best moment on the record for me. It features a lot of chipmunk vocals over these really post-punky beats and bass lines, but then from there it erupts into all of these quirky 80s dance beat switches. Nothing I haven't heard recycled by one rap artist or another in the 2020s, but to hear it all kind of compiled in the super chaotic way on this track I thought was kind of cool, even if I found the rapping to be sort of subpar and to be kind of filling a void, as there's not a whole lot lyrically that sticks with me from it. The more confessional writing on Closed Caption I thought hit a lot harder. There are some moody guitar licks throughout the instrumental, as well as a super powerful, depressive, and heavy horn build at the very end, probably the most epic and over-the-top moment on the record that I thought went well. Super grand and gives a lot of urgency to the feelings of regret and also suicidal ideation that are mentioned in the lyrics. So yeah, that's a highlight, but sadly from here, the record doesn't really pick up. In fact, I would say things drop off even further past the midpoint. There's Earth 2 with its shouted babble and super repetitive refrains. It's a pretty annoying track, very mind-numbing as well, and has no business being almost 3 minutes. The overly processed guitars, as well as stiff drums on Airborne, sound like a few shades punchier than just like a super bad MIDI rock retool. Very soulless, no fire to it whatsoever. It's just drab to listen to on impact. There's also the obnoxious full English, where throughout much of the track we get these repeated lines of blank with my London bitch, that blank being filled in with some kind of, reference to the UK or English culture. And I suppose the joke lands a couple of times, but to hear it repeated well over a dozen times with kind of a different thing slipped in over and over and over, it really kind of loses its flavor fast, to where even the decent Tizo touchdown feature at the end cannot save it. By the time we hit the song Lana Del Rey, are we even trying? It doesn't seem like it. I'm just getting the sense that we're using the guise of a punk aesthetic to hand in these really trashy and effortless instrumentals. But I will say, even though some of the flows and inflections on the rapping at the very start of the closing track come across painfully goofy and like that of a cartoon character, the song does develop into a pretty interesting multi-genre epic, which leaves me thinking maybe past this point, Paris, Texas does have some legitimate and creative potential. But if that potential is actually there, it's not being fulfilled on this record, I'll say that. As the writing is uninteresting and underwhelming, the rapping is average much of the time at best, even though yes, it is definitely weirder and more out there than your average mainstream artist. The content of these tracks is often forgettable, and the performances and production assembly are pretty weak and disappointing and boring too. Despite all this record's piss and vinegar and attempts at forging an alternative appeal, it's really, really, really missed the mark. I'm feeling a light 3 on this thing. Transition, have you given this record a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like, please subscribe, and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Paris, Texas, forever.